Hey folks, this is Kelani. In the most recent video about how to make gold right at the start of an expansion, I briefly talked about the scrapper and how it's going to be fairly important because it looks like it's the only source of a rare crafting material called Expulsom. Well, let's take a bit of a closer look at the whole system because if you're a crafter, you're definitely going to want to know how this whole thing works. But even if you're not too bothered about the Expulsom, the scrapping mechanic could potentially make you quite a bit of gold when compared to just throwing away your spare gear at the nearest vendor, or even disenchanting it. So let's take a deep dive into the new scrapper system and see how everything works right now. This has been changed a few times already, so I really wanted to weigh on this topic as late as I could, and with Battle for Azeroth releasing later today, I don't think I really could have waited much longer. So unless something absolutely crazy happens in the next 24 hours, no more changes should come to the scrapper system. Alright, so where can we find these scrappers? They're located in your Battle for Azeroth faction hub, somewhere near the profession trainers. For the Horde, that's on the bottom level of Untitled, right next to the engineering trainer, and for the Alliance, it's just on the edge of this entire profession's corner, once again near the engineering trainer. Anyone can use the scrapper, it's not tied to any profession whatsoever. If you fancy scrapping a few bits and bobs, feel free to do so. Thankfully, this system isn't just a copy-paste of the Obliterum system where you could only do one item at a time. Now you can do 9, and the scrapper will work its way through all of the gear you throw into it. I'm sure an add-on will come along that makes this even easier, but honestly I don't feel like you really need one, unlike with Obliterum. So what is the scrapper actually for? It works kind of like disenchanting, except instead of enchanting materials, you get back raw materials that would have been used to craft a similar piece of gear. So if you throw in plate gear into the scrapper, you'll get back ore and blacksmithing materials like flux, because that's what would go into creating plate gear. Mail gear is going to give you scales and bones, leather gear will give you leather and bones, and cloth gear will give you cloth. When it comes to weapons, again it depends on what it's used to craft that type of weapon. You'll get ore for simple weapons like daggers, swords and axes, but you'll get enchanting materials from wands or staves. You can also get gems, including rare gems, from any jewelry you throw into the scrapper, which could be an interesting opportunity to make some quick gold, or it might just drive down the price of gems altogether. But the main component most people will be after from the scrapper is Expulsom. Expulsom can come from any piece of gear you throw into the scrapper, but it looks like higher item level gear has a higher chance of return, which makes sense. Right now the scrapper seems to be the only source of Expulsom. It hasn't been tied to world quest rewards for a long time. People are reporting leveling up multiple gathering professions without seeing any at all. It used to come from disenchanting items, but again from reports on the beta and on websites like Wowhead, enchanters haven't seen any for a long time either. Dungeons drop hydrocores instead of Expulsom, so it looks like we're just stuck with the scrapper. Expulsom is also bind on pickup, so you won't be trading it around or selling it on the auction house. Expulsom is used in every high-end crafting recipe. A huge amount of the stuff is required for the 370 and 385 crafted pieces of gear, so if you're a crafter, chances are you're going to be very interested in this stuff. It's also used in a lot of inscription recipes, but was removed from every enchant and also from flasks. So depending on what professions you're running around with, you might either want as much Expulsom as you can get your hands on, or not really care about it too much. So what should you do with your spare gear? Should you vendor it, scrap it, or maybe disenchant it? Well, I would say that's going to highly depend on when you get the piece of gear and what type of gear it is. I would scrap any and all jewelry you find. The chances of getting rare gems will always outweigh the vendor price of an item. After that, you're probably just going to want to keep an eye on the market for raw materials. If all leather and cloth are still selling very high, you'll probably get way more money from scrapping the items rather than vendoring them, especially at the start of an expansion. If I were you, I would keep all of my leveling gear and quest rewards in my bags, and every time I get back to the main faction hub, scrap it all and throw the materials on the auction house. At the start of the expansion, you could make a good chunk of change just from scrapping stuff instead of vendoring it. Enchanters are in a bit of a weird situation because some crafting recipes do require Expulsom, the weapon recipes mostly. So if you want to craft some wands or staffs, you might want to scrap your extra gear instead of disenchanting it, at least until you get enough Expulsom to craft what you want. If you just want to make enchants to sell or to use, I would disenchant absolutely everything you get instead of scrapping it. Enchanting materials are often highly valued early on, so DEing could make you more gold when compared to scrapping. So if Expulsom is bind on pickup and it only comes from the scrapper, which means it only comes from spare gear. How in the world do you go about farming the stuff? That's actually pretty easy. Any form of content which rewards you with gear you don't actually need will help you farm Expulsom. Quests will be a decent source of this until you manage to clear most of them out, because you're guaranteed your piece of gear at the end of certain quests. Either use it and scrap your old piece of gear, or just scrap the new piece of gear if you don't need it. After that, any world quests which reward gear are also going to be great, because once again, the rewards are guaranteed. Scrap it if you don't need it, which makes gear world quest pretty valuable as you progress in item level. Even if you don't need the piece of gear, it's more fodder for the scrap-o-matic. After that, you're relying on a little bit of luck, because most other types of content don't guarantee loot. But you can run through a few dungeons and hope some gear drops for you. I'm sure in a few weeks every dungeon, Mythic Plus dungeon, or even raid you run will yield quite a lot of loot you just don't need. In Legion you would have vended it or disenchanted it, but in Battle for Azeroth you can scrap it for raw materials and more Expulsom. As a quick note, enchanters should definitely be DEing any epic items. Crystals are generally going to be worth way more than the Expulsom or raw materials, so keep that in mind. But what about alts? If Expulsom is bind on pickup, doesn't that mean we can't really use alts for crafting without playing them a whole bunch, just like how Blood of Sargeras worked? Sort of, but thanks to the differences between Expulsom and Blood of Sargeras, you might actually be able to farm Expulsom for your alts really easily. They're not going to get as much loot from questing or dungeons or world quests if you aren't playing them, but if they're a crafting alt, you can still craft a bunch of gear to scrap for yourself. The beautiful thing about early crafting recipes is that they're all bind on equip, so if you have a leather worker and leather is really cheap, you can buy up stacks of leather, craft the most efficient leather recipe you have, and then send those items over to whichever alt needs the Expulsom. If you have one alt who is a jewel crafter, one who is a blacksmith, one who is a scribe, and they all need Expulsom, just send over your leather crafts and scrap them on that alt. Any Expulsom you get will be bound to the alt, and you'll even get a bunch of raw materials back at the same time. Send those items back to your crafter, craft more items, rinse, repeat until you have enough Expulsom on your alts. We can see so many different shuffles to make gold in Battle for Azeroth with how the scrapper works, and I'm really excited to find some profitable combinations of professions. I'm going to have an alt with tailoring, an alt with leatherworking, and another alt with blacksmithing. That way I can take advantage of the cheapest raw material at any given time to hopefully generate a good chunk of Expulsom for any of my alts that might need it, or just to funnel more Expulsom to my main for the inscription recipes. You're not really limited to keeping the professions on your main character this time around, you're just going to have to jump through a few hoops to make it work. It's probably going to be a lot of back and forth mailing items from one alt to another, but hopefully Expulsom shouldn't ever hinder you too badly. Being able to recycle your gear over and over and over again as it goes through the scrapper should make the whole endeavour quite a bit cheaper too. Getting materials back from each craft basically just reduces the amount of materials you need in the first place. If you're curious about which trade goods usually end up the cheapest, it's typically leather and scales. They don't have any other uses besides the leather and mail gear, yet they have an amazing gathering and collection rate. Leatherworkers create their own gathering nodes by slaughtering beasties out in the world, find a good spot, kill everything you can see and carve them all up. It's a lot easier when compared to running around looking for herbs or ores, that's for sure. If you have spare time, you can level up your crafting alts and do the gear world quests whenever they pop up, just for an extra boost. When you get to the point of needing hydrocores, well, that's a different story. Hydrocores only come from dungeons. On the beta, I think everyone was guaranteed a hydrocore or two for a mythic dungeon, so you might have to gear your alts up to a pretty decent level if you want them to be able to farm hydrocores, but Expulsom should be a lot easier. Now, there is one other method for obtaining Expulsom that I didn't touch on. There's a new transmute for alchemists which generates 5 Expulsom on a daily cooldown. Not a huge amount, but at least you don't have to rely on the random kindness of the scrapper. Honestly, I don't think it would be worthwhile picking up alchemy just for the transmute, but if you're already making potions and flasks and whatnot, I guess there's no harm in it. You'll need Expulsom for the new cauldrons, the new alchemist trinkets, as well as the follower equipment, so it's not exactly going to go to waste on an alchemist. As the expansion unfolds, I'm really interested to see if the price of raw materials will balance out with the vendor price of gear, or if the potential to get raw materials from scrapping will just tank the price of raw materials altogether. Later on, when the prices of raw materials get pretty low, you might end up getting more gold from vendoring items instead of scrapping them, but if that's the case, raw materials will have less supply and might increase in value. That's why I think we'll see some form of equilibrium establish itself around the vendor price of gear. Though as more and more people run less normal and heroic dungeons, I would expect a lot more gear to get sharded too, chew instead of scrapped. Honestly, the scrapper changes so much about how the market could react, it's really fascinating to think about. It's the first time we've been able to break down gear in this way. I can't wait to see if it ruins everything or it ends up stabilizing the market entirely. But that's it for this video. Hopefully you should all get into Battle for Azeroth with enough information on this new system to really take advantage of the possibilities it opens up. What do you think of the scrapper overall? A great addition to the game, or something that has maybe gone too far? Leave all your thoughts in the comment section below. A big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. You can see their names floating by on your screen. If you want to join these lovely guys and gals, you can find a link in the description below. Remember to leave a like just below the video before you leave, and if you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. But apart from that, thanks for watching folks, good luck and have fun, and as always I will see you next time.